witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System.
You heard me saying a prayer for someone I really could care for.
If you're watching this on the public YouTube feed, that means that this week is the 40th anniversary of the NES's launch in America. And I regret to say it, but it's also the 10th anniversary of NES Works, which I am on track to finish right around the time of the NES's 80th anniversary. I don't have a fully suitable 40th anniversary episode of NES Works slated for the near future. I mean, the next game on the agenda is The Three Stooges, which doesn't really reflect all that Nintendo accomplished in the space of 4 years following the system's launch. So instead, let's pause for a moment to look back at the most significant games to ship over the course of the year during which the NES truly came into its own, 1988. I have to admit that my designation of 88 here is not entirely objective. I bought my own NES at the beginning of 1988 and spent the next 12 months getting swept into its world. And the 12 months after that, and after that. But consider this, the NES only existed in the greater New York metro area in 1985. It didn't go fully nationwide until summer 1986. 1987 saw the console building up steam with the arrival of third parties and a growing install base, leading up to the first holiday season in which the NES managed to sell out at retailers nationwide. Ask me how I know. So 1988 was the first year that the console truly had critical mass, and the year that its software library began to mature and diversify. By the end of 1988, pretty much every kid in America who wanted an NES had one. The schoolyard game swap and lending network had achieved critical mass. You could even buy breakfast cereal and read magazines about video games. It was like the Atari and arcade craze of the early 80s never went away. And most of all, the games ruled. I've previously designated 1989 as peak NES, and I do stand by that. But I consider 1988 pure NES. The last year where quality and innovation in NES software outpaced the rush to dump any old garbage onto the market and gobble up those precious allowance bucks. 1988 was also the last year that the NES existed without any real external pressure from competition, before the 16-bit consoles and Game Boy arrived. Sorry, Master System 7800, it's true. So let's look at the dozen classics that defined the NES in 1988. The games that pushed the console over the edge from hit to all-timer. As always with these lists, I like to give a shout out to a game or two that didn't quite make the cut, but still deserve some praise. For 1988, that honor goes to two media property tie-ins, whose developers went above and beyond the Call of Duty. Rather than just dialing it in, they dared to bend genres and push boundaries of game design in order to engage with the substance of the original works in a meaningful way. These are not good games, but they're very courageous and creative. Sometimes licensed games could be creative, all the way back to some of the weirder releases for Atari 2600. But usually an 8-bit licensed game simply amounted to a developer sticking some relevant graphics into an existing design and calling it a day. That's not what happened with Rambo or Golgo 13, however. In both cases, the studios behind these titles clearly made a genuine effort to create games about those properties. Rambo, for example, sends you out exploring into the jungles of Vietnam. And the movie's narrative shapes the structure of the game. Eventually, you find the hostages you need to rescue, but the mission is scrubbed, and you're forced to venture back into the jungles all on your own. At one point, you take control of Rambo's native guide, Ko, and play through a brief, combat-free sequence to rescue the hero. It's pretty interesting stuff for a 1988 action game. And that's to say nothing of the fact that it borrowed so heavily from Zelda II 6 months before Zelda II reached the US, or the way that it attempts to enhance non-linear exploration by creating directional tracks through the jungle. As for Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode, developer Cebu Lis essentially created a new story for the famous manga assassin that perfectly echoes the beats and structure of a true Saito Productions creation. Over the space of 13 chapters, Golgo 13 travels the world, meets with contacts, faces rivals, including a clone of himself, and even snipes targets with his custom M16. It's a very messy game, with weirdly abstract visuals and totally loose controls and mechanics. But in a world where the high watermark for action gaming expectations was Mario running left to right for 32 stages, the high-stakes espionage, treachery, casual sex, and first-person shooting of Top Secret Episode were like nothing anyone had ever experienced in a video game before. Coming in at the bottom of this list, we have a coin-op to console conversion that really sort of embodies the entire NES arcade to console pipeline for this era. Technos Japan did not attempt to give NES fans a faithful direct conversion of Double Dragon, much to the disappointment of many. But the game that they did create is worthy of praise in other ways. By 1988, I think everyone had begun to come around to the fact that the NES could handle classic arcade games with style, but current coin-ops were a bit beyond its capabilities. If not, well, Double Dragon certainly helped clue them in. The Master System totally trounced the NES on a technical level, and Sega and Tonka leaned hard into that divide for their marketing. This would turn out to be a tactical error down the road, but in 1988 it meant that the NES looked pretty paltry by comparison when it came to arcade ports. A lot of developers did their best anyway, which wasn't usually all that good. But some said, right, let's just rebuild this sucker from the ground up. This was a case of double pragmatism, really. Nintendo had a widely reported policy that forbade developers from publishing the same game on NES or Famicom and on competing systems, a restriction that many developers circumvented by creating NES games that were wholly distinct from the arcade original and direct ports to other systems. With Double Dragon, that meant Technos dropped the cooperative multiplayer, one of the key selling points of the arcade original, but they made up for it by 1. Rebalancing the game to play more fairly for a single person, and 2. Integrating a sort of experience-based leveling system. Unlike in other versions of Double Dragon, you have to earn most of Billy Lee's skills over time. Landing kicks and punches and knockout blows earns you points beyond the simple scoring table, and for every 100 experience points you collect, you advance a level and unlock a new ability. Elbow smashes and jump kicks and spinning tornado strikes. This makes the game a bit of a slog if we're being honest, but it does make for the most reasonably balanced solo Double Dragon title on the market. Plus, there's a prototype one-on-one fighting game in here for people whose siblings want to play with them. On its own, this Double Dragon with its revamped skill system is a bit of a misfire. But in the grand scheme of history, you can clearly see that Technos was grasping its way toward the role-playing systems of the River City series, which makes this an imperfect yet important slice of video game history. If Metal Gear for NES were a pixel-perfect conversion of the MSX original, this game would be sitting in the top entries of this list. But for some strange reason, Konami decided to make a lot of changes to Metal Gear, mostly for the worst, when bringing it over to NES, and that is why it's sitting near the bottom instead. Metal Gear is, at its most reductive level, The Legend of Zelda with machine guns, but it's also more ambitious than that. Not only does protagonist Dave, codename Solid Snake in the classic G.I. Joe style, stand better odds if he sneaks around and avoids combat, he also makes his way through his mission to infiltrate an enemy fortress with the aid of constant communication from his support team. And a massive load of tools that turn what could have been a simplistic Commando-esque run and gun into a genuine action-adventure experience with hints of role-playing. There are story twists, character developments, and surprises to be found, all behind a system of locks and gates that require the use of tools, like keycards and gas masks. The one downside is that Konami's Famicom team remixed the original MSX game in the process of bringing it to console, and in no way for the better. Well, maybe the music's better, but the fortress layout is simplified, the tasks and objectives streamlined, and the final boss that gives the entire franchise its name is actually nowhere to be seen. This is a diminished version of a masterpiece. But that masterpiece was good and groundbreaking enough that this still turns out to be a top title for NES in 1988. The original Castlevania was, simply put, an action masterpiece. The sequel was kind of a mess in a lot of ways. But like many games we saw in 1988, it was a mess that pushed at the boundaries of what a video game could be. And it's become something of a classic, almost despite itself. Simon's Quest takes the action out of the castle and across the Vania. It demands players search the countryside, roaming through forests, lakes, marshes, and rivers in search of 5 mansions where Dracula's assorted body parts have been stored for safekeeping so that heroic Simon Belmont can pile them all up and set fire to them before the vampire's posthumous curse kills him first. In the process, you need to master an RPG-like experience system, grapple with a growing inventory of weapons and tools, and deal with the citizens of Transylvania. So far, so good. Unfortunately, Simon's Quest is one of many NES games of this era that took the wrong lesson from the likes of Hydlide and Super Mario Bros. Those games tucked secrets away in every corner of their worlds, and waves of imitators attempted to do the same thing, sometimes very badly. Simon's Quest makes a few grave mistakes by filling said quest with esoteric secrets that players need to master in order to advance, which is fine in principle, but leaving players with no sense of how to accomplish the next objectives works best in a game like the Tower of Juraga, where you can only deal with 2 screens of space at a time. In an open world like Simon's Quest, locking progression behind an unintuitive action in a specific place with a particular item leads to hours of players wandering in search of a solution. Worse, those solutions aren't really forthcoming, since half the citizens in Transylvania lie to you, and you have no way of determining the liars from the truth tellers. It's a maddening game that more or less demands the use of a strategy guide. Still, despite this immensely frustrating design choice, it manages to be one of the most evocative NES games of 1988, thanks to its great visuals, audio, and controls. Not to mention the immersive world that is Transylvania, a continuous side-scrolling space like nothing any video game before it had ever managed to present. Well, except Rambo, I guess, but technically Castlevania II came first in Japan, so I'm sticking to my guns. NES fans had a couple of options for playing hockey games in 1988. Konami's Blades of Steel may have looked more realistic and sophisticated, but it's Pax Softnica's ice hockey for Nintendo that ultimately withstood the test of time, despite being incredibly simplistic looking, or actually maybe because of it. There's not a lot to this game. You pick one of a handful of teams and then put together a roster from 3 different player types: lean, average, and stocky. This simple decision completely determines how your team functions. The skinny guys are fast but fragile, while the bulky dudes move at a snail's pace but barrel through anything in their path. So this amounts to creating an offensive-focused team of glass cannons, a defensive team of living meat walls, or something in between. This no-nonsense approach to strategy allows you to sample different styles in each game, minimizes the need for team management, and keeps the pace snappy and arcade-like. Nintendo cranked out some groundbreaking all-timers in the sports space on NES, but this might be their crowning achievement. This or golf, take your pick. It doesn't have Metroid or Vania in the title, but for my money, Sunsoft's Blaster Master is where the exploratory action RPG platform game came into its own. Honestly, if it didn't have those crummy top-down sequences, it would be a top 3 contender for 1988. Yes, it's another prehistoric attempt to create the almighty Metroidvania genre. A lot of those in 1988, really, but Blaster Master stands out from the rest thanks to its fantastic premise. You control a high-tech battle vehicle, a sort of spring-loaded combat tank that can roll around, blast everything you encounter in 3 directions, and, this is the big one, leap. A jumping tank, what will they think of next? Later in the game, it's also a flying tank, a tank that crawls along walls and ceilings, and launches homing missiles, and bursts of lightning. And it can also eject its driver to run around on foot as a very squishy, very tiny little guy who has to perform key actions without his vehicle in order to advance. That's also a cool idea, except that most of the on-foot sequences involve a perspective shift that turns the game into a top-down maze shooter. And even that wouldn't be so bad if not for the wretchedly unbalanced difficulty of these parts. Little Jason has a gun that he can juice up to become incredibly powerful by finding the correct icons, and that's good. But every time Jason takes damage on foot, his gun drops a level of power. So not only do you lose health each time you take a hit, you also lose your attack strength. This just makes for a grueling, unpleasant slog of a shooter. Which is a shame because the rest of the game shines. But all the boss battles are crammed into the top-down phases, and it just absolutely sucks the joy from Blaster Master. So it's quite a testament to the absolute exploratory genius of the tank sequences that the game still comes out so high in the rankings. While hardly sporting cutting-edge graphics or gameplay, Bobble nevertheless manages to transcend its crude graphics and dated single-screen action. Anyone who regularly played NES with a friend or sibling can attest that this was a game that justified coming back, time after time. Bobble offers a different kind of multiplayer than Nintendo's games, which usually involve an element of antagonism. It's tough to be mean to your companion here, and the game is a lot more fun, not to mention only completable, when you set up tag team combos and assists. But all you need to do in Bobble is spit bubble at monsters to imprison them, then burst those bubbles to turn the creatures within into fruit. That's it. Burst all the baddies, and you move along to the next level. Except, Sometimes you don't move to the next level. Sometimes you jump like 10 levels at once. Sometimes you end up in weird rooms full of mysterious glyphs. Bobble is one of those games whose creators looked at Tower of Druaga and Super Mario Bros. And all of their secrets and said, ooh, us too. But unlike so many others who did that, the creators of Bobble got it right. You don't have to master a bunch of secrets in order to complete this game. You just need to reach the end with a friend and defeat the final boss. But along the way, you can stumble across a ridiculous number of hidden details and gameplay factors that completely change the flow of each playthrough. Small factors, like the number of items you collect, the time in which you complete an objective, and more. This just makes Bobble all the more appealing. Secrets that enhance the game, rather than confound the player. It's almost enough to make you forgive that earworm of a soundtrack. '88 saw a lot of second-generation sports titles for NES. Technically, I suppose the best of them was Tecmo Bowl, which reconsidered 10-Yard Fight. But since I don't especially care for American football, my vote for Best Follow-Up of the Year goes to SNK's Fighting Golf. There's not a lot to say about Fighting Golf, really. It's well-made, visually appealing, and intuitive. You can select several different player avatars, including a female golfer, alongside superstar player Lee Trevino. And it's good and fun. I don't know, man, it's golf, but better. What do you want me to say? Sometimes it's enough to be the best in the genre, rather than a reinvention of the format. Zelda II: The Adventure of Link comes with a lot of baggage in tow. A massive delay for the US release, a wild design overhaul from the original game, and intense difficulty spikes that don't always seem fair. But taken on its own merits, it stands as an excellent game, it's had an amazing influence on other titles, and still holds up pretty well. Like Simon's Quest, Zelda II does expect players to deal with a fair amount of, let's be honest here, unreasonable bullshit. But there's less of it, and you have to winnow through a lot less subterfuge and misdirection in order to get to the end of the game. This is a weird sequel, since it plays almost completely unlike the original Legend of Zelda. It's a side-scroller with legitimate role-playing elements, one that strips Link of his secondary weapons in favor of magic spells. But it's an incredibly influential game. If the Tower of Druaga and Hydlide opened Japan's collective third eye to the joys of role-playing on consoles, Zelda II crammed those concepts into a container shaped like Dragon Buster and turned on the larger mainstream audience, including folks outside of Japan, to the potential of RPG hybridization. Zelda II has a little bit of a weird legacy in the US since it arrived about a year later than Nintendo originally intended due to manufacturing complications. So while we collectively knew about it, since around the time the original Zelda debuted in 1987, Nintendo kept kicking the ball down the road, and Zelda 2 was perpetually coming soon for a year and a half. Meanwhile, everyone else localized games that had been inspired by Zelda 2, like Simon's Quest and Rambo. So Zelda 2 didn't have quite the same impact here among those of us who were tuned into the weird stuff on NES, at least not the way that it did in Japan. But of course, the sequel hype, and the cool box, and the hefty marketing budget allowed Zelda 2 to outsell all of those imitators. So I guess in the end it didn't matter, unless you were just the weird kid who actually enjoyed Rambo like I was. Anyway, pretty good, highly influential game. Number 5 on the list seems about right. Cooperative action came into its own on NES in 1988, and Konami somehow managed to squeeze that into a fairly manic shooter with Life Force. It's not entirely uncompromised versus the Japanese release, but it still combines simultaneous play with great graphics, excellent music, dual-mode combat, and a customizable Gradius-like power-up system. Americans missed out on a lot of the shooters that showed up on Famicom in Japan, including the actual Gradius 2, but Life Force helped lessen that blow. Life Force isn't a pure Gradius game, because it's arguably better. There's a whole convoluted taxonomy of history to Life Force that I don't need to get into here, but all that matters is that it's basically Gradius, yet two people can play at once, and it switches perspectives from horizontal to vertical with each stage. Visually, this game set a new high bar for shooters that would take years for any other NES entry in the genre to match. Mechanically, it carries forward the great customization system that first appeared in Gradius, but with new weapons. And because it's meant to be played cooperatively, Life Force doesn't send you back to a checkpoint when you die. Instead, you just respawn and zip onto the current screen with no interruption. If you're fast enough, you can even snag your lost options as you return to the fray. With top-tier visuals and music, great stage themes, new levels and bosses that didn't appear in the arcade, Life Force is easily one of the best shooters on NES, even if you don't play it co-op. Even if you don't use the iconic Konami code to gen up 30 extra lives. Speaking of which. However, no NES two-player title in 1988 managed to reach the iconic heights of Contra. Yes, sadly, NES began the year on a high note, and it was all downhill from there. If I were to sum up 1988 on NES in 3 words, it would be iteration, cooperation, role-playing. Role-playing is a compound word, thanks. Contra doesn't have much in the way of RPG elements, but it certainly brings iterative improvements to NES. In terms of console precedent, it plays kind of like Russian Attack, except awesome. In terms of franchise precedent, it's a visually downgraded arcade adaptation that improves on the coin-op in literally every other respect. The shift away from a vertical coin-op screen orientation actually helps improve the action for once. The levels are expanded and improved with more interesting hazards and challenges. The 3D-ish maze sequences work better here, the bosses are more memorable, the music sounds better. It's just a better game all around, despite the hardware downgrade. And of course, it allows 2 friends to play together simultaneously without suffering major compromises, despite the additional crap flying around the screen. Contra simply kicks ass on NES. A good arcade game elevated to greatness. And yeah, it doesn't hurt that the Konami code became codified here as a 30 life modifier. The only way you could hope to finish the game while playing with a less capable friend or sibling who kept dying and leeching your reserve lives away. Hey, did you know that in Japan, Super Mario Bros. 2 was actually called, wait for it, Super Mario Bros. USA? That's right, finally, a Mario game to be patriotic about. In hindsight, people tend to view Super Mario Bros. As a weird swerve, a bizarre sidebar to the evolution of Super Mario games that would be almost entirely ignored by subsequent entries. But you know, in the days where there was no such thing as Super Mario Bros. 3 and its sequels, when no one had ever even heard of a Doki Doki Panic, none of that actually crossed anyone's minds. So Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't have a score or allow you to throw fireballs. So Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't have a timer, and you could play as more than just Mario and Green Mario. So what? By this point in the NES's life, NES games had begun to see sequels, and some of those sequels were pretty weird or different from their predecessors. Case in point, Gradia's sequel Life Force, and Zelda's sequel Zelda II. Super Mario Bros. 2 looked a lot more stylish than the original game, and its world felt more like a place you inhabited rather than one you simply dashed through. The removal of ratchet scrolling and the many different ways you used to explore its stages created the sensation of a very different, very interesting, very creative take on Mario. Sometimes you ran and jumped, sure, but sometimes you rode a machine or a bird or a flying carpet to get where you needed to go. Sometimes you climbed vines, or ascended towers, or took a rocket ship, but sometimes you bombed through walls or dug through sand. Some levels were simple, sprawling platform challenges, but many took the form of convoluted mazes. And for some reason, there was a slot machine at the end of every level, a slot machine that fed into the game's mechanic for hiding secrets. No oblique mysteries or lying townspeople here. Super Mario Bros. 2 hid most of its secrets behind a magic potion that allowed players to go behind the world in search of slot machine coins and health upgrades. Nothing complicated or frustrating, but certainly something that demanded trial, error, and a bit of memorization or note-taking. Super Mario Bros. 2 did more to define the worlds and characters of the Super Mario universe than any other entry in the series until, Super Mario RPG. And it's not even a real Super Mario. You can play as a non-Mario character the entire game if you want. But it is fun as hell, and good, and cleverly designed, and challenging without being unreasonable. It's a great sequel, even if it is a weird sidebar. Hindsight is 20/20 and all, but at the time, this was the biggest thing on NES for 1988. I went back and forth a bit on my top pick for this list. Super Mario Bros. 2 seems like it would be the popular pick for Best Game of the Year, and certainly it must have been the year's best-selling game in the aggregate. But for all that it brought to the console and to the Mario franchise, it just didn't embody the entire NES ethos the way that Bionic Commando did. Bionic Commando embodies just about everything that defined the zeitgeist of the NES for 1988. Okay, so there's no cooperative play. But look at all this other stuff that it did. It adapted an arcade game to the console by taking enormous liberties. So enormous that it practically constitutes a new game. Yeah, you can see the core mechanics of the arcade original at work here, and most of the arcade game's levels appear here in some form, But for all intents and purposes, this is a new game altogether, with 3 times as many action stages as in the arcade version, most of which are much more complex and puzzle-like in nature. Plus, those action stages are interwoven with neutral areas, which function like towns in RPGs, or action RPGs. You speak to people, gather clues and directions, and acquire power-ups there. Meanwhile, all of these stages are interconnected on a world map that requires players to explore carefully and find the keys and tools they require to unlock new stages and make further progression. And the RPG elements don't end there. Not only do you acquire a wide array of weapons and gear that generally don't vary radically in power, but rather confer advantages in specific situations, you also collect bullets, experience points really, from fallen enemies, which will cumulatively boost your health level. All of this is tied together by an evolving storyline that begins as a search and rescue mission before turning into a fight for the fate of the world. Said fate is jeopardized by none other than a resurrected Adolf Hitler, his second zombie showing on NES in 1988, who seeks to belatedly finish the task of conquering the world and can only be stopped when you launch a bazooka into his face and blow up his skull. Clearly, this would be one of the best games ever for that simple finale alone, but the fact that the exploratory elements work together so well with all of the other systems, and the fact that the swing mechanics that replace the jumping of a standard platformer are so fluid and refined, all of that makes this a legitimate masterpiece. Easily the best NES game of 1988 in my book, and an absolute top 5 for the console in general. They don't make them like this anymore, but they should. On the next NES Works special, we continue celebrating 40 years of NES by lamenting 1988's crappiest crap.